Zephyr had always dreamed of studying at the most prestigious university in the galaxy. What nobody mentioned in the brochure was that said university happened to be located on a Class Z death world that the locals cheerfully called Earth. The shuttle pilot, a grizzled Vorthan with 3 eyes and an impressive collection of battle scars, had refused to land anywhere near the campus. "This is as close as I get to that nightmare planet," he'd growled, practically shoving Zephyr toward the escape pod. "Good luck, kid. Try not to get eaten by the local wildlife." Zephyr's pod crash-landed in what the humans apparently called a parking lot, which seemed to be a designated area for storing their armored death machines. The first human Zephyr encountered was jogging past in minimal protective gear, apparently for recreational purposes. The human actually smiled and waved at the smoking crater where Zephyr's pod had landed, as if alien crash landings were just another Tuesday morning. "Oh, hey there," the human called out, not even breaking stride. "Welcome to Earth. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Zephyr looked up at the sky, which was filled with a burning ball of plasma that humans called the sun, and wondered if this creature was being sarcastic. On Zephyr's home planet of Quellion, exposure to their much weaker star required full radiation suits and limited exposure times. Here, this human was practically naked under the deadly solar radiation, and seemed to be enjoying it. Professor Hendricks, Zephyr's faculty advisor, arrived 20 minutes later in what humans called a minivan. The vehicle looked like it had survived several small wars, which, knowing Earth's reputation, it probably had. Professor Hendricks emerged from the death trap with a coffee mug in one hand and a pastry in the other, both of which were probably toxic to most galactic species. "Sorry I'm late," Professor Hendricks said, somehow managing to sound genuinely apologetic while consuming what appeared to be liquid stimulants and processed sugar. "Traffic was murder. Hope you weren't waiting long." Zephyr stared at this human who had just casually referenced murder while discussing transportation delays. The professor seemed completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a planet where the very air was corrosive to most life forms, and the gravity was strong enough to crush a Flibian in seconds. "So," Professor Hendricks continued, apparently mistaking Zephyr's horrified silence for normal conversation, "ready for orientation. We've got a great program planned. Campus tour, meet your roommate, maybe grab some lunch at the cafeteria. Fair warning though, it's pizza day, so things might get a little crazy." Zephyr made a mental note to update their will. The campus tour began with what Professor Hendricks described as a gentle stroll through the quad. Zephyr quickly realized that humans had a very different definition of gentle than the rest of the galaxy. The path wound through an area where massive earth trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying ominously in what the professor called a nice breeze, but felt more like a Category 2 atmospheric disturbance. "Oh look," Professor Hendricks said, pointing at a small furry creature that had just emerged from the underbrush. "A squirrel! Aren't they cute?" Zephyr watched in horror as the cute creature bared its teeth and chattered aggressively before launching itself into the air with the kind of acrobatic precision that would make a galactic marine jealous. On Quellion, anything that could move that fast was either predatory or highly venomous, usually both. "They're completely harmless," Professor Hendricks assured them, apparently noticing Zephyr's defensive posture. "Well, unless you try to feed them. Then they get a bit bitey." A bit bitey. Zephyr filed this under human understatements that could get you killed. The tour continued past what humans called a duck pond, which was apparently a strategic water source guarded by armored waterfowl with serrated beaks. A group of human children were throwing food at these clearly territorial creatures, while their parents watched approvingly. Zephyr began to suspect that humans might actually be the most dangerous species on their own planet. Meeting Jake, Zephyr's assigned roommate, did nothing to improve the situation. Jake was sprawled on what appeared to be a furniture torture device called a beanbag chair, consuming something called energy drinks, while simultaneously operating multiple electronic devices. He looked up when Zephyr entered, and grinned with the kind of expression that on any other planet would signal imminent attack. "Hey there, roomie," Jake said, somehow managing to sound friendly despite showing his teeth. "Earth treating you well so far?" "I have survived the initial contact phase," Zephyr replied carefully. "Cool, cool. Hey, want to hear about my weekend plans? I'm going rock climbing with some friends. Then we're going to try this new extreme sports place downtown. Should be epic." Zephyr's translator helpfully informed them that rock climbing involved ascending vertical stone surfaces using only primitive gripping techniques, while extreme sports was apparently a human term for recreational activities with high mortality rates. Jake was discussing these potential death sentences with the same enthusiasm most species reserved for mating rituals. Down the hall, Zephyr could hear their fellow exchange students having what sounded like complete nervous breakdowns. A crystalline from Nexus 7 was repeatedly muttering, "The gravity, oh stars, the gravity," while someone who sounded like a tentacled one was sobbing about atmospheric pressure differentials. "Man, your alien buddies are really dramatic," Jake observed, apparently mistaking species-appropriate terror responses for performance art. "Wait till they try the cafeteria food. That'll really give them something to cry about." Zephyr wondered if it was too late to transfer to a nice, safe university on a Class A paradise world, preferably one where the locals didn't consider potential death a recreational activity. Zephyr's first class was Introduction to Planetary Sciences with Dr. Martinez, a human professor who had the disturbing habit of discussing catastrophic geological events like they were casual dinner conversation. The classroom itself was another exercise in human death-defying architecture, with massive windows that offered a panoramic view of Earth's hostile sky and no visible emergency exits. "Today we'll be covering seismic activity," Dr. Martinez announced cheerfully, pulling up a holographic display of the Earth's crust. "As you can see, our planet sits on several active tectonic plates that regularly shift and collide, causing what we call earthquakes." Zephyr's homeworld had been geologically stable for over 10 million years. The concept of living on a planet that regularly tried to shake its inhabitants to death was beyond comprehension. Yet Dr. Martinez was describing magnitude 7 earthquakes like they were minor inconveniences, roughly equivalent to heavy rain. "Of course, we also have to consider volcanic activity," the professor continued, apparently unaware that half the alien students were having panic attacks. "The Ring of Fire is particularly active this time of year. Makes for some spectacular views if you're into that sort of thing." A Phlibian in the front row actually fainted when Dr. Martinez casually mentioned that some humans lived within 50 kilometers of active volcanoes for the scenic beauty and rich soil. Zephyr was beginning to understand why Earth had been quarantined by the Galactic Safety Council. The humans in the class, meanwhile, were taking notes as if this was perfectly normal educational content. One actually raised her hand to ask about the best hiking trails near Mount St. Helens, which Zephyr's research indicated was a dormant superweapon that had previously destroyed several square kilometers of landscape. "Great question, Ashley," Dr. Martinez replied. "I'd recommend the Boundary Trail. It offers excellent views of the crater, and if you're lucky, you might catch some volcanic activity." If you're lucky. Zephyr added this to their growing list of things humans say that should trigger evacuation protocols. During the break, Zephyr overheard a group of human students discussing their weekend plans. One was going storm chasing, which apparently involved deliberately pursuing dangerous weather phenomena for entertainment. Another was planning something called whitewater rafting, which sounded like it involved navigating torrential water flows on primitive flotation devices. "Oh, that sounds fun," said a third human. "Last time I went rafting, I nearly got swept over a waterfall. Good times." Good times. Nearly dying in a 100-meter vertical water drop was apparently what humans considered good times. The crystalline student from Nexus 7, whose name was apparently Prism, leaned over to Zephyr with what might have been a whisper if crystallines had vocal cords. "I am beginning to suspect that humans may not be entirely sane by galactic standards." Zephyr nodded grimly. "I'm starting to think the Class Z designation wasn't about the planet's natural hazards. It was a warning about the inhabitants." Back in class, Dr. Martinez had moved on to discussing hurricanes, tornadoes, and something called fire season with the same enthusiasm most professors reserved for discussing their favorite research topics, which, Zephyr realized with growing horror, this probably was. Zephyr's first Earth weather experience came during what Jake cheerfully described as just a little thunderstorm. Zephyr had been peacefully attempting to study when the sky suddenly began assaulting the planet with concentrated electrical discharges, each one containing enough energy to power a small space station. The sound alone was like being inside an artillery bombardment, which technically it was. "Isn't this awesome?" Jake shouted over the sound of atmospheric warfare, standing at the window with his face pressed against the glass like he was watching entertainment. "I love a good storm. Really clears the air, you know?" Zephyr cowered behind what humans optimistically called a desk, which appeared to be constructed from processed plant matter and hope. On Quellion, electrical storms required immediate evacuation to underground bunkers. Here, Jake was treating it like dinner theater. "Sometimes I like to go out and stand in the rain during these," Jake continued, apparently confusing deliberate exposure to electrical death with recreational activity. "Really makes you feel alive." The storm passed after what felt like several geological ages but was apparently only 30 minutes by human time measurement. Jake immediately suggested they grab some grub, leading Zephyr to the campus cafeteria where humans gathered to consume substances that would violate several interplanetary chemical weapons treaties. The cafeteria assault began with something called buffalo wings, which Zephyr discovered were not actual wings from Earth's flying buffalo, but rather portions of smaller flying creatures that had been coated in what could only be described as liquid fire. Jake consumed 12 of these chemical weapons while maintaining casual conversation, occasionally pausing to wipe what appeared to be actual tears from his eyes. "Oh man, these are mild today," Jake complained, reaching for a bottle of concentrated capsaicin that was labeled ghost pepper sauce and decorated with imagery suggesting mortality. "Usually they have more kick." Zephyr watched in fascination and horror as Jake applied additional chemical warfare agents to food that was already glowing faintly in the visible spectrum. A nearby human student was consuming something called Carolina Reaper nachos while discussing quantum physics homework, apparently unaffected by the fact that her consumption of military-grade irritants. "Want to try some?" Jake offered, holding out a wing that was literally steaming. "I prefer to keep my internal organs in their current non-dissolved state," Zephyr replied. "Suit yourself. More for me." The entertainment portion of the evening proved even more disturbing. Jake's idea of relaxing weekend viewing was something called Planet Earth, which Zephyr initially assumed would be a peaceful documentary about Earth's less dangerous regions. Instead, it turned out to be a comprehensive catalog of Earth's most efficient killing machines, narrated by a human who spoke about apex predators the way most species discussed pleasant weather. "Oh, this is a great episode," Jake said, settling back with a bowl of what appeared to be artificially flavored corn kernels that had been subjected to controlled explosions. "It's about great white sharks. Did you know they can launch themselves completely out of the water when they're hunting? Like, their whole body, just flying through the air. Nature is so cool." On screen, a creature that appeared to be nothing but teeth and primal hunger was indeed launching itself into the air with the kind of ballistic precision that would make a guided missile jealous. The narrator was describing this obvious doomsday weapon like it was a particularly interesting garden-variety flower. "And look at this," Jake continued as the program shifted to show creatures called saltwater crocodiles. "These guys have remained basically unchanged for millions of years. Perfect predators. They can hold their breath underwater for an hour and have a bite force of over 3,000 pounds per square inch." Zephyr made a mental note to never, under any circumstances, go near Earth's water sources. The breaking point came when Jake mentioned his weekend plans in more detail. "So, Saturday, me and some friends are going skydiving in the morning, then we're hitting this new bungee jumping spot in the afternoon. Sunday's gonna be great too. We're planning to go swimming with sharks. There's this place where you can get in a cage and they bring the great whites right up to you. Should be epic." Zephyr stared at this creature who was casually describing a weekend itinerary that included deliberately falling from great heights with minimal safety equipment, followed by voluntarily entering the hunting grounds of aquatic apex predators for recreational purposes. "Jake," Zephyr said slowly, "do you have any concept of mortality?" "What do you mean?" "Death, the permanent cessation of biological functions. Do you understand that it's something to be avoided?" Jake looked genuinely confused. "Well, yeah, obviously. That's why we wear parachutes when we skydive. And the bungee cord is inspected regularly, and the shark cage is totally safe. It's made of reinforced steel. We're not stupid about it." At that moment, Prism's crystalline form appeared in the doorway, vibrating at a frequency that indicated extreme distress. "Zephyr, I require immediate consultation. Crix has been exposed to human educational content and is experiencing what your species might call a complete psychological breakdown." They found Curix, a normally composed tentacled one from the Andromeda sector, huddled in the corner of the common room, all 8 of their appendages wrapped around their head in what was clearly the galactic equivalent of the fetal position. On the screen in front of them, a human documentary was cheerfully explaining the mating habits of praying mantises, specifically the part where the female systematically consumes the male's head during reproduction. "The narrator says this is normal," Crix whispered, their voice barely audible through their universal translator. "They describe it as nature's way. On this planet, even reproduction is a form of combat." Zephyr looked at the screen, where a human scientist was explaining with obvious fascination how certain spider species also practiced post-coital cannibalism, and realized that they needed to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Education Council, immediately. Filing a complaint with the Galactic Education Council required navigating Earth's primitive communication systems, which Zephyr discovered was like trying to perform surgery with farming equipment. After 3 hours of what humans called technical difficulties and what any rational species would classify as systematic infrastructure failure, Zephyr finally managed to establish contact with the Council's Emergency Response Division. The being who answered was a Valdorian administrator named Clerk Vex, whose multiple eye stalks immediately began twitching in what Zephyr recognized as the bureaucratic equivalent of barely contained panic. "Oh no," Vex said, before Zephyr had even finished explaining the situation. "You're calling from Earth, aren't you? Please tell me this is about a scheduling conflict and not another incident involving the local fauna." "Define incident," Zephyr replied carefully. "Has anyone been eaten by anything? Has anyone voluntarily exposed themselves to the planet's weather systems? Has anyone engaged in what the humans call outdoor activities?" "All of the above." Vex's eye stalks drooped in defeat. "I'll transfer you to Ambassador Cleet. This is above my security clearance." Ambassador Cleet turned out to be a Zephyrian with the kind of expression that suggested they had seen things that would break lesser minds. Their office appeared to be located on a space station in high orbit around Earth, which Zephyr was beginning to understand was probably the minimum safe distance for conducting diplomacy with humans. "Ah, another exchange student," Ambassador Cleet said with the weary tone of someone who had given this speech many times before. "Let me guess. You've discovered that humans treat mortal peril as a form of entertainment, that they consume chemical irritants for pleasure, and that they've somehow convinced themselves that living on a planet that actively tries to kill them is perfectly normal." "That's an accurate summary, yes. And you're wondering why the Galactic Education Council would approve an exchange program with a species that appears to be collectively insane." The thought had occurred to me. Ambassador Cleet activated a holographic display that showed Earth's official galactic classification. "Student Zephyr, I need you to read Earth's planetary designation very carefully." "What does it say?" Zephyr squinted at the display. "It says Class Z Death World, Quarantine Level Maximum, inhabited by... Oh, go on. Inhabited by apex predator species designated Homo sapiens. Warning: inhabitants demonstrate complete disregard for personal safety and exhibit pack-hunting behaviors. Approach with extreme caution. Diplomatic contact authorized only for military recruitment purposes." The pieces were starting to fall into place in Zephyr's mind like the tumblers of a very large, very terrifying lock. "The exchange program," Ambassador Cleet continued, "is not actually an educational initiative. It's a diplomatic contact program designed to study human behavior patterns before we formally invite them to join the Galactic Defense Alliance. You see, Student Zephyr, humans weren't classified as dangerous because they live on a dangerous planet. They were classified as dangerous because they are dangerous to everything else in the galaxy." Zephyr's mental image of humans began to shift from friendly but absolutely to friendly but absolutely terrifying. "Are you telling me that Jake, my roommate who thinks jumping off cliffs is fun, is actually a member of the galaxy's most feared warrior species?" Jake sounds like a typical human adolescent, yes. They don't even reach full combat maturity until their mid-20s. Combat maturity? Oh yes, adult humans are even worse. They start families and reproduce while living on that death world, which requires levels of confidence and aggression that most species can only achieve through intensive military conditioning. They've turned survival into an art form, and then they taught their children to treat it as play. The ambassador pulled up another display showing various human recreational activities. Zephyr watched in new understanding as humans threw themselves off mountains, attached to fabric wings, deliberately entered underwater caves that would trap most species permanently, and engaged in something called free solo rock climbing, which appeared to involve ascending vertical stone faces without any safety equipment whatsoever. "These aren't the activities of an insane species," Ambassador Cleet explained. "These are the recreational preferences of apex predators who have become so dominant on their planet that they have to invent artificial dangers to stay entertained. When a human tells you they're bored, that's when you need to start worrying. So the exchange program is our way of studying them before we ask them to help us deal with the Zorthak invasion. The Zorthaks have been expanding through our sector for 50 years, conquering every species they encounter. They're ruthless, efficient, and completely without mercy. And you think humans can stop them?" Ambassador Cleet smiled, which was a disturbing expression on a Zephyrian. "Student Zephyr, humans evolved on a planet where everything is trying to kill them, where the weather systems could power small civilizations, and where the local wildlife includes creatures that hunt for sport rather than food. They've turned this into their home. They raise their young there. They consider it paradise." The ambassador leaned forward. The Zorthox think they're terrifying because they've conquered a few dozen peaceful civilizations. But they've never encountered a species that thinks dangerous means fun and lethal means interesting. We're not planning to send human soldiers to fight the Zorthax, Student Zephyr. We're planning to send human tourists. Zephyr thought about Jake's weekend plans, about Dr. Martinez's casual discussion of planetary catastrophes, about the way humans consumed liquid fire and called it mild, about how they'd turned their death world into a university campus and invited alien students to visit. The Zorthax don't stand a chance, do they? The betting pool in the Galactic Defense Council currently has humans winning the war in under 6 months, Ambassador Cleet confirmed. The only debate is whether they'll do it through superior tactics, overwhelming force, or by accidentally terrifying the Zorthax into surrender by trying to be friendly. Zephyr understood now why Jake had seemed so confused when asked about mortality. To humans, death wasn't something to be avoided at all costs. It was just another variable to be managed, like weather or traffic. They'd been living with it so long that they'd forgotten other species found it threatening. Common final question, Ambassador. Does Jake know? Does he understand what humans are? Student Zephyr, that's the most terrifying part. Jake and his species genuinely think they're perfectly normal. They have no idea that they're the galaxy's ultimate warriors. They think everyone else is just unusually cautious. 3 months later, Zephyr stood at the podium in the Earth University auditorium, staring out at an audience that included 17 different alien species, 43 humans, and one very nervous-looking Ambassador Cleet, who had been forced to attend the graduation ceremony in person. The final presentation requirement for the exchange program was a comprehensive analysis of human culture, which Zephyr had initially thought would be straightforward academic work. Now knowing what they knew, it felt more like giving a military intelligence briefing disguised as anthropological research. Fellow students and faculty, Zephyr began, my presentation today is titled Human Social Behaviors, a Study in Adaptive Lethality Disguised as Hospitality. Professor Hendricks beamed proudly from the front row, apparently missing the slightly ominous undertones of the title. Jake gave an enthusiastic thumbs up, a human gesture that Zephyr had learned was meant to convey encouragement, but looked remarkably similar to several interspecies threats. During my time on Earth, Zephyr continued, I have observed that human social interaction patterns are based primarily on the assumption that all participants are capable of surviving in conditions that would be immediately fatal to most galactic civilizations. For example, humans regularly invite guests to grab a bite, not realizing that their food preparation methods constitute chemical warfare by most planetary standards. A ripple of nervous laughter came from the alien section of the audience. Prism's crystalline form was vibrating at frequencies that suggested either amusement or the early stages of structural collapse. Human recreational activities provide perhaps the most illuminating example of their species' characteristics. What humans call extreme sports are actually training exercises for combat scenarios that most military academies would consider too dangerous for simulation. The fact that humans engage in these activities voluntarily and, furthermore, pay currency for the privilege demonstrates either complete fearlessness or a collective death wish. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly, apparently interpreting this as a compliment to human ingenuity rather than a psychological evaluation. However, Zephyr said, reaching the part of the presentation they had spent weeks crafting, the most remarkable aspect of human culture is their complete inability to recognize their own exceptional nature. Humans genuinely believe that their casual relationship with mortality is normal, and that other species are simply risk-averse rather than rationally terrified of everything about this planet. Jake leaned over to whisper something to Ashley, the human student who had asked about hiking near active volcanoes. Whatever he said made her giggle, which was a sound that Zephyr had learned could mean either harmless amusement or predatory satisfaction, depending on context. This cognitive blind spot, Zephyr continued, extends to their interaction with other species. Humans interpret normal fear responses as shyness, survival instincts as unfriendliness, and emergency evacuation protocols as party pooping. They have somehow convinced themselves that they are a naturally hospitable species, when in fact they are hospitable in the way that apex predators can afford to be generous with creatures that pose no threat. Ambassador Cleet was making subtle hand gestures that Zephyr interpreted as either encouragement or a warning to tone down the military analysis. Zephyr decided to split the difference. In conclusion, they said, humans represent a unique evolutionary solution to hostile environmental conditions. Rather than developing better defensive capabilities, they simply eliminated the concept of defense from their behavioral repertoire and replaced it with enthusiastic curiosity about potential threats. This has resulted in a species that treats galactic-class dangers as opportunities for personal growth and character development. The applause was mixed. The humans clapped enthusiastically, apparently delighted to be described as enthusiastically curious. The aliens clapped nervously, probably relieved that the presentation was over. Ambassador Cleet clapped very slowly, in what Zephyr hoped was approval, rather than the prelude to diplomatic sanctions. After the ceremony, Jake found Zephyr at the reception, which featured a buffet that included at least 6 substances banned by the Geneva Convention of Civilized Worlds. "Great presentation, buddy," Jake said, loading his plate with what appeared to be miniature chemical explosives disguised as appetizers. "Really made us sound interesting. Hey, I've got some friends who are planning a trip to climb Mount Everest next summer. You should totally come with us when you visit again. It'll be fun." Mount Everest. Zephyr's research indicated that this was a geographical feature so hostile that humans had turned reaching its summit into a recreational challenge, despite the fact that it regularly killed visitors through altitude sickness, hypothermia, and gravitational misadventure. "That's very kind of you to offer," Zephyr replied carefully, "but I should probably focus on my therapy sessions first." "Therapy? For what?" "Post-traumatic stress from living on your planet for 3 months. Jake looked genuinely concerned. "Oh man, I had no idea you were stressed. You should have said something. We could have done some relaxing activities together, maybe some whitewater rafting or rock climbing. Those always help me unwind." And there it was, the perfect encapsulation of humanity in a single statement. Jake's solution to stress was to engage in activities that would be considered enhanced interrogation techniques on most civilized worlds. "I'll keep that in mind," Zephyr said. 6 months later, Zephyr was back on Quellion, sitting in the comfortable, completely non-lethal environment of their family's habitat pod, when the news broke. The Zorthok invasion fleet had encountered the first human diplomatic vessel at the edge of the Terran system. According to reports, the humans had attempted to establish peaceful contact by inviting the Zorthok commander to visit Earth for cultural exchange and some great hiking opportunities. The Zorthok fleet had immediately surrendered. Not because of superior human firepower, not because of advanced technology, but because their intelligence division had analyzed the invitation and concluded that any species that considered a Class Z death world suitable for hiking opportunities was too dangerous to fight. The war was over before it began, ended by humans trying to be friendly. Zephyr's communication device chimed with an incoming message from Jake. "Hey, Zephyr, hope you're doing well. Just wanted to let you know that some new alien friends are coming to visit Earth next semester. They're called Zorthax, I think? Anyway, we're planning a welcome party with some outdoor activities. Rock climbing, volcano hiking, maybe some extreme weather camping. Should be awesome. You're totally invited if you want to come back and join us. Miss you, buddy." Zephyr stared at the message for a long moment, then forwarded it to Ambassador Cleet with a single comment. "I recommend approving the humans for immediate membership in the Galactic Defense Council. Also, I'm updating my emergency contact information to list Earth as my vacation destination of last resort." Because if Zephyr had learned anything during their time among humans, it was that there was no problem in the galaxy that couldn't be solved by finding the right human and asking them if they wanted to try something new and exciting. The fact that new and exciting usually meant potentially lethal was just a bonus. After all, as Jake would say, that's what made it fun.